The following extracts are taken from the writings of Hugh Allen. Recording by Apratim Viraj Singh. Part 1. The Odd Chance. Some years ago, when I was showing a friend round our jungles, he suddenly turned to me and asked why I had come out with only a walking stick. In a place like this, isn't there every chance of meeting a tiger? He added. I do not think he really believed me when I told him that the chances of meeting a tiger were practically nil, and that it was possible to walk through the jungles every day for years without ever seeing one. But, he persisted, what would you do now, without a rifle, if a tiger suddenly came charging towards us? I was not able to convince him, nor was I really surprised that I could not. The idea that a tiger is always a dangerous animal and liable to attack on sight is one shared by nearly everyone unfamiliar with the jungles. In fact, however, the tiger is very seldom dangerous until provoked, and in its normal state does not molest man. Indeed, the tiger wants to do so little with man that it will always stay out of his sight if it possibly can. Yet, in a way, that friend of mine was right. The odd chance does occasionally turn up and you meet a tiger bent on mischief even though it has not been provoked in the ordinary way. But just how rare that chance really is may be gauged from my own experience. For more than 10 years, I have walked through the jungles every day, and that odd chance for me has turned up just once. It was on a stifling evening at the end of our first hot weather. Tea had been over about an hour, and I was sitting on the veranda when Babs reminded me that the meat in the larder was low. Almost as she spoke, I heard peafowl calling from the direction of Stony Ford, a crossing over a nala some quarter of a mile away. A few minutes later, I had left the house with a 12-bore and a pocketful of cartridges. As I set off towards the sound of the calling birds, angry black clouds were building up above the distant hills. The rains were due to break out at any moment. I was making for a strip of scrub jungle that fringes the bank of a large nala. In there, if the peafowl eluded me, I might later put up some pig or come across a barking deer or a chital stag. Through this jungle runs a smaller nala that joins the larger one. This is about 10 feet wide and some 6 feet deep, and I dropped down to its sandy bed when I reached it. The banks are lined with many kinds of jungle trees. That day, some of these were already in full leaf, while others were performing that yearly miracle of producing delicate little leaves and buds from a rock-like soil seemingly devoid of a drop of moisture. Peafowl are difficult to surprise, but a stalk along the sandy bed of the nala could be made in silence. A little farther down I hoped to find some of the birds feeding and get a shot before they could fly out of range. I started to creep forward and kept going for about 10 minutes. Then, while edging round a bend, I was suddenly stopped dead. Just in front of me, and apparently asleep under a patch of shade, was a large leopard stretched on the sand. But there was something wrong. A closer look showed that its attitude was unnatural. The head was twisted grotesquely, and one forepaw was slightly bent and held drunkenly in the air. The leopard was dead. As I started to approach it, my nose told me it had been dead for quite some time. A swarm of blue flies buzzed up as I came nearer and wafted the sickly sweet smell of death more strongly to my nostrils. Something had eaten a small part of the hindquarters, and the sand all around the leopard was wildly churned. The sand was too dry to show what kind of animal had been feeding. I began to look around me, and almost at once spotted something else. A little further down the nala, hard against one bank, were the remains of what had once been a cheetal stag. All that was left now was the head, a few pieces of skin and splintered bone, and 2 almost whole ribs. Both animals had been dead for about 2 days, and I was just beginning to wonder what had happened when I noticed that a small flame of the forest tree had fallen across the nala some 10 yards further down. It was blocking the nala completely, but starting not far in front of it, I could see in the sand the mark of a drag which disappeared into the collage of the fallen tree. Something heavy had been dragged through to the other side. I went up to the tree, and after tearing away some of the leaves and smaller branches, saw something black lying within 2 yards of me. It was the dead body of a huge wild boar. I climbed over the tree and looked down at it. The mask was set in a ferocious snarl, and the one tush I could see was stained brown with congealed blood. The remains were fresh, the meat hardly tainted, but the body of the boar had been horribly ripped and torn, and once again a little had been eaten off the hind quarters. This was the work of a tiger. And if that blood-stained tush meant what I thought it did, the tiger had not had the fight all his own way. As I got up from examining the boar, I suddenly realized that the jungle around me was strangely quiet. I looked up at the trees for vultures and found not a single one in sight. The truth came to me the next second. Somewhere very close at hand, the tiger was lying up. It had to be. With the dead leopard lying pretty much in the open, that was the only explanation for lack of vultures. It was now just 6 o'clock, and a little darker than usual. The black clouds I had noticed when leaving the house had crept up overhead, and muffled thunder was vibrating in the stifling air. All at once, I made for the bank and climbed quickly out of the nala. Its sandy bed now was an unhealthy spot, for this was a likely time for the tiger to return for a feed. Once at the top of the bank, I moved to a clump of saplings and stood listening. The jungle here was still scrub, but very thick. The previous year it had been cut over, and now, with the amazing rapidity with which the forests revive, the old stumps had sent up several shoots to a height of many feet. Visibility in any direction was only restricted to a few yards. As I stood on the bank listening, I was a little uneasy. To be so near the kills at a time when the tiger might come back to feed was asking for trouble, and I should have liked to know if it had already either seen or heard me. I was still thinking about that when, without the slightest warning, the tiger appeared about 5 yards in front of me. It came from behind a small cluster of teak like a conjurer's illusion. At first, it did not see me, for it was moving obliquely away, but I must have given some slight start of surprise, which caused it to stop and turn. I saw then that it was a tigress, and she was looking straight at me. I can still see those eyes even today. But why I remember them so clearly is not because they held the threat of sudden death, but because they were so vacant and not seeing me at all. It was as if I might have been some usual piece of jungle scenery, and when the tigress had gazed for several seconds, she turned calmly away and then passed out of sight behind some cover. As she went, I saw that she was plastered with dried mud, and along her left flank ran a long, bloody gash, and she was moving with a marked limp. To this day, I cannot understand why that tigress's sudden arrival caused me so much surprise. She so obviously had to be somewhere close, yet when she came I was caught completely off my guard and made no attempt to bring her down. As she moved away, an easier target could hardly have been imagined. It was the sort of chance sportsmen often dream of, but so seldom get in reality. Perhaps, though, that little jungle god, who looks after fools was tapping on my shoulder, for had I fired instinctively, it might well have been, for 2 reasons, the last trigger I ever squeezed. The moment after the tigress disappeared from sight, I recovered my wits. It had been an odd encounter, and there was much I still did not understand. But there was no doubt that she was a badly crippled animal, and if I was quick, there was still a good chance to put her out of her pain. After the blistering heat of the day, she should now be making for water. She had certainly gone in the right direction. There was a pool in a larger nala about 50 yards away. If I could surprise her there, she would be a sitting shot from the bank above it. I gave her a minute's start and then followed. About 20 yards from where I was standing, there is a little clearing among the trees. On the other side of it, the ground rises steeply and is covered with bushes and small trees. When I came into this, I stopped and looked around. There was no sign of the tigress. I was about to go on when I glanced down at my weapon. The next second I got a nasty shock when I realized that, aided and abetted by my bad memory, I had been acting like a lunatic ever since finding that butcher's shop in the small nala. In the excitement of the moment, I had forgotten 2 things. One, that I was carrying a shotgun, and the other, that it was loaded in the left barrel with number 6 and with buckshot in the right. However, it was a mistake easily rectified, even though I am never happy with a shotgun against a tiger. In the handful of cartridges I had brought out, there was 1 lethal ball. I broke the gun and took out the number 6 and then fished about in my pocket until I found the case I wanted. All of a sudden, the next moment, the tigress's roar seemed to burst in my ear. Then I heard her crashing towards me from the high ground a little to my right. The next second, she hurtled into view and with a mighty bound landed in the clearing some 30 paces in front of me. The shock and surprise were so complete that the ball cartridge fell from my fingers as I was putting it in the breech. I know now that this mishap undoubtedly saved my life, for if the gun had been loaded, I should have used it at once and before I'd had time to appreciate the situation. It took me perhaps 15 seconds to realize that the animal before me now was not the tigress, but a tiger. That he was bent on mischief there was no doubt. The moment he landed on his feet, he whipped about to face me and then began weaving quickly from side to side across my front. At the same time, he was throwing up his head and shattering the air with bellowing roars. Then he began to make quick feint attacks. He would dart and crouching low to the ground with his hindquarters slightly raised and ears laid back against his head. All at once, he would check with his lips, mouthing a vicious snarl that spat out between gleaming fangs. The next second, he would break his feint with a great sideways leap to start weaving and roaring again. At any second, that tiger was coming in. He was playing like a cat with a mouse, and the real attack could not be delayed long. Each time he threatened, my eyes went to the end of his tail. The moment that flickered, he would spring. All this time, I had been creeping slowly backwards, fascinated by that prancing yellow body. The shotgun still hung open over my left arm. Should I suddenly snap it shut and try for his head with the buckshot in the right barrel? Before I could make up my mind, I saw something that ruled this idea right out. From the corner of my eye, I had spotted the tigress. She was sitting under a small tree just a few yards to my right, like a big cat before a fire. On her face was a pleased smile as she watched the scene before her. When I found her so close, I suddenly knew what was really going on. These two were mating. That would explain her extraordinary behavior earlier when she had ignored me so near the kills, for it is not uncommon when the female's in season to find her going about in a kind of dazed, ecstatic trance. After that diversion, for the fraction of a second, my eyes snapped back to the tiger. There was no ecstatic trance about him. He was right out for business and getting more excited every moment. This encounter was just what he wanted, a chance to show off before his sweetheart, and if that charnel house in the Nala was anything to go by, this tiger had had some practice. I was still moving slowly backwards when something prodded me in the small of the back. I whipped round to find that it was a small tree. I had reached the limit of the clearing. Very carefully, I edged round the slender trunk. At least it was a stick of cover, but even as I got behind it, I knew that the game could not go on for much longer. The tiger must come in now. He knew as well as I did that behind me lay the jungle and the safety of the trees. Help came from the most unexpected quarter. A thin tongue of lightning flickered down in a brilliant, violent flash. Hard on it came a deafening crash of thunder from right overhead. It stopped the tiger dead in his tracks. Then came the rain. At first, just a few large drops spattered against my hat and bare arms. Then, to another crash of thunder, a deluge roared down from the leaden sky. A solid sheet of water was suddenly cascading before my eyes, and soon splashing up from the ground in a fine mist. Quickly taking advantage of this heaven-sent diversion, I moved farther behind my tree. But the tiger had given up. As the rain rattled and bounced off his streaming back, it seemed as though all the ardor had soaked right out of him. Watching him closely, I put another buckshot cartridge in the empty chamber and then slowly closed the gun. As it snicked shut, I slipped off the safety catch. But the game was over. With a great shake of his rain-soaked body, the tiger suddenly wheeled about and then trotted away. Almost at once, he was joined by the tigress. The last I saw of them, they were bounding away together towards some broken land where they probably found shelter in a cave. That was undoubtedly my lucky day for several reasons. Firstly, if I had met the tiger instead of the tigress near the small Nala, I do not think he would have hesitated for a single second. He would have come for me at once, because I was far too near his kills, and a tiger's temper is always short whenever he is mixed up with the tigress. The tiger, of course, had killed that leopard. As I see it, the tiger must have surprised the leopard soon after the leopard had killed that cheetal stag. But the leopard, and some leopards are very bold, must have refused to give way over his own kill. Then the tiger went for him, not so much for the possession of the carcass, but to show off to his mate. The tiger had attacked the boar too, but it is not unlikely that the boar proved such a tough antagonist that the tigress had waded in to help, and in the fracas that followed, she got that long gash down her side. And now, the two reasons that might have proved fatal if I had shot at the tigress. Well, nothing is more certain than the fact that I should have given her the choke barrel if I had fired the moment she appeared, and merely peppered her with number 6. That would have been enough to bring her straight at me. After that, from such close quarters, I doubt whether I should have killed her with a single charge of buckshot in time. But even if I had, there was still the tiger about which I still knew nothing about. I don't think I would have gotten away a second time if he had caught me unawares, bending over the dead body of his lady love. Part 2. Midnight Encounter. I started out by saying that a walking stick was an adequate weapon for most strolls through the jungle. That, of course, was before times had changed, and before I had met any of the wounded animals I was to come across later. Now, I seldom go far without a rifle, and this episode is one of the first reasons that changed my mind. It was a dark night, and only when the taillight of the bus was winking to a red pinpoint way up the road did I remember my torch on the front seat of the bus. I had just returned from Jabalpur a day earlier than Babs expected me, and when I got off at Matkuli, there was a 2-mile walk through the jungle to get home. When I set off, it was just after 11 o'clock, and there was no reason to expect anything else but a pleasant stroll through the dark night. The village street was deserted, as most people were already in bed, but halfway down I found Bihari loading his cart with grain for an early start to market. For a few minutes I stopped to chat, and when he knew that I was walking home without a light, he offered me a lantern and an axe. I accepted both gratefully. A light would keep me onto the track, and the little jungle axes make comfortable walking sticks. Just beyond the village, the track wanders through fairly open country. When I was crossing this, the night was not too dark, as the bright stars showed a few yards off the track ahead before it was bitten off by the night. But after I had gone a mile, the black mass of the jungle loomed up against the dark sky, and when I came under the trees, I could see nothing. The lantern was almost useless. It had probably never been cleaned in its life, and the flickering flame was striving to show through a glass darkly. For a few hundred yards I trudged on with my footsteps, a series of muffled crunches on the sandy track. Then I startled the first wild creature. From somewhere over to my right came the sharp alarm call of a barking deer. A warning taken up almost at once by a cheetal hind farther away. The behavior of wild animals always interests me, and so I stopped, wondering whether anything else would answer the cheetal. Nothing did, but the call of the barking deer came twice more, each time a little nearer than the first. I couldn't be sure, but that coming nearer suggested that something was wrong, and that the deer was frightened of something more dangerous than I was. The wind said that, for it was blowing from behind me and almost straight to the deer. My scent must have been strong in its nostrils, yet still it came on and called once more. I stood, waiting and undecided. Deer sometimes seek the protection of man against the big cats, but there was something else I suspected as well. I stepped off the track and began tramping noisily through the fallen leaves and swinging the lantern high. When I had gone some 50 yards and the wind was full on my back and blowing straight towards where I judged the deer to be, I stopped. Then I gave a low whistle and the sharp bark of the muntjac. Nothing happened for 2 minutes. Then, hesitantly, a faint rustling from not far away. Slowly, the rustling came nearer, an animal tiptoeing through the leaves. For the last few paces, it came with a rush and broke into the circle of light thrown by the lantern. A young, barking deer, its horns just beginning to sprout. "What goes on, fathead?" I asked it. "You can't look after yourself in your own jungles, eh?" This was Sammy, and we had had him since he was a few hours old. The men who had brought him said that his mother had abandoned him in the jungle. That may or may not have been true. Those men were poachers, and it was more likely that Sammy's mother had disappeared into their cooking pots. Sammy, then, was the merest slip of a Disney fawn, all long, spindly legs and soft, fluffy ears. In spite of this, he thrived from the first day on a baby's bottle. He took to it like an experienced infant, and the only real difficulty we ever had about his meals was to persuade him that he had had enough. For the first few months he was content to wander near the house, but as he grew older he started to roam farther afield. We seldom tried to restrain him unless we knew it was more unsafe than usual for him to be out. On this night, when I met Sammy, he had been wandering the jungles after dark for several months. He was always back by daybreak, usually bedded down somewhere near the front veranda, preparing to sleep. However, the time now was just a few minutes to midnight, and something on the prowl had obviously alarmed him as I was coming up. so whether he liked the idea or not, the safest place for him was home. Sammy submitted meekly while I tied one end of a scarf around his neck, and when we set off to rejoin the track, he trotted along quite willingly, close to my side. We had gone perhaps 100 yards when he stopped suddenly and brought me up with a sharp tug on the scarf. As I could not pull him on without hurting his neck, I stepped back to shove him on from behind. When I touched him, he was trembling, and he came in close to my knees, pressing hard against them. He kept his head high in the air, while his dilated nostrils sniffed the wind and his eyes stared over to our left. I straightened up and began to listen. There was nothing but the cicadas and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. At last, I managed to urge him on, but his gait now was like some crude marionette. Jerky and stiff, his head held woodenly erect and still staring to the left. All at once, I heard it. Just the faintest rustle of dry leaves from behind us and to the left. Impossible to know what it was, and the only thing I could do was to go on pushing Sammy along the track towards home. I suspected a leopard, one of the bold ones, not much scared of a light and thoroughly familiar with man. I raised the lantern as high as I could and waved it about. The rustling didn't come again, and I went on pushing Sammy home. I was just thinking that Sammy's nose must have played him false when the most alarming noises broke out only a few yards to our left. With a sudden loud crashing, some large animal started to force its way through heavy brush. That lasted only a few seconds, and then, whatever it was, began to thresh madly about as though engaged in some high-spirited frolic. As the noise went on, I realized what it was. Not a leopard, but a bear. Though what the fool was doing, only another bear would know. But even with a bear, it was safer to clear out fast. He is a jungle clod, far better left alone even when he seems on his best behavior. I lowered the lantern almost to the ground and tried to make Sammy quicken his pace. But he was still reluctant to move along the track and dug in his small pointed hooves as I shoved him on from behind. It was difficult to move him, and after some moments of hard shoving, I was sweating and getting rather bad-tempered. All at once I stopped. Why waste so much energy? Our leopard had turned out to be a bear, and even that, as far as I could tell now, had gone away. But even if it was still about, it would not hurt Sammy, and so he could be left to take his usual chance in the jungle. As I bent to untie the knot in the scarf, he was still trembling, and every sinew under the twitching flesh was strung tight. I tried to calm him down, stroking his back and caressing his ears. He took no notice. His neck stayed stiff, and he kept his eyes staring straight ahead. Then, without warning, he reared back and nearly jerked the scarf from my hand. A second later, he yapped his sharp bark of alarm. Now he was tugging so violently that I was wrenched right round. For a few moments I fought him, then something made me turn my head and look over my shoulder. In the light of the lamp, I saw a vague form lying across the track. It was only a few yards from us, and I whipped up the lantern to see it better. It was a leopard. Sammy saved us, for even as I stared, the front paws teetered as it steadied to spring. Then the scarf snapped tight, and I was wrenched back as the leopard left the ground. It is not easy to describe something that caught you unawares, and then happened in the twinkling of an eye. But even though I had been pulled out of the way, my immediate impression was that the leopard had missed us deliberately. Stranger still, when the leopard hit the ground, he seemed to have lost control and hurtled out of the light in a great burst of sand and flying leaves. The next instant, that mad threshing started again. It was as though the leopard had been gripped by some terrible anger and was tearing wildly at everything within reach. Those furious sounds were now coming from behind us, and they suddenly goaded Sammy to life. All at once he was off, racing for home as fast as his legs could carry him. And so was I. The end of the scarf was still in my hand, and it seemed the best idea in the world to be flying from that crazy brute in the bushes. Only when we came to our long drive at the end of the jungle did we slacken speed. Then, panting for breath, we went more slowly until we reached the house. Once there, I took Sammy across to the cow sheds and bundled him in with the calves. He went willingly, with none of the prancing nonsense he usually put on whenever we shut him up for his own good. While Babs boiled some coffee and made sandwiches, I was thinking about that curious leopard. I was still shaken, but the more I thought about what had happened, the more I realized how very odd the whole incident had been. It was altogether too odd to be dismissed as just a lucky escape. Something was wrong, and so wrong that it could not be left as it was, because strange happenings like this often lead to trouble. At that moment, I could think of no explanation to fit all the facts. Indeed, the only thing I was sure of was that leopards just do not behave as the one we had recently met. And to have seen it all was perhaps the most perplexing aspect of the whole affair. As a general rule, the leopard wears an invisible cloak, an annoying fact that accounts for a great deal of its success. By the time the coffee and sandwiches were finished, I had decided to go out again. I changed into a pair of light rubber shoes and put some new batteries in the spare torch and into the one mounted on a rifle. In case these preparations should give the idea that I was solemnly setting out to stalk a leopard through a black jungle strewn with crackling leaves, let me add quickly that that was not my intention at all. The theory I had formed by now was that this leopard was dangerous because it was desperate. It had probably been wounded, and on account of that was so hungry that it was prepared to take risks to get a meal. If that was true, there was a fair chance that it was still about, and if it was and still making all that noise, it should be possible to locate it before it found me. That's not so brave as it sounds. This time, I should be accompanied by the 3 dogs, and not by a frightened deer. These were odds no leopard would ever take on. If it found us first, there was no doubt it would bow to a superior force and make off. We set off briskly along the drive. When we came to the end of it, we slowed, and 100 yards into the jungle beyond, we stopped to listen. We were showing no lights, so the blackness around was intense and alive with the noise of millions of insects. Somewhere to our left, I heard monkeys in a tree. Their sentinels had seen us and made us out for what we were. Now they were passing us on as friends to their brothers round about by rustling the branches. They had a message for us, too. The leopard was not near us, and so we could go on slowly towards where I had left him. Our eyes were getting more used to the darkness. Now, for a few yards ahead, the track was dimly visible, and on each side of it the faint outlines of trees. On the soft sand, trodden free of dead leaves, we were creeping along without a sound. After 10 minutes we stopped to listen again. There was nothing to hear, and this time there were no monkeys near us. That was a pity, as we were getting close to the scene of my recent encounter. After another 50 yards, I stopped suddenly when a sound ahead caught my ears. It had come from not far away and to our left, and from the sounds that had followed the first, there was little doubt that we had found the leopard. But the noise it was making now was more puzzling than ever. That mad, Threshing had stopped, and in its place was a light, muffled thumping with an irregular rhythm. As I listened, I knew that the unlikely had happened. We had found the leopard first, and he still knew nothing about us. Once more we crept quietly forward. A few steps now would bring us into the ideal night range of about 40 yards. At my heels, I could sense the excitement mounting in the dogs. They could scent the quarry for what it was and were eagerly waiting for the shot. Soon we were as close as I thought we could safely get. But before switching on the torch, I tried to place the leopard exactly by the noise it was making. In front of me, I could see the black mass of some bushes, and if the noise was an indication the leopard was under them, I raised the rifle and pressed the switch on the torch. The light blazed and lit up a large clump of thorns. It was much denser than I expected, and there was no sign of the leopard. I kept the torch on and played the beam quickly over the thorns. All the time, I was expecting the leopard to take some violent action. But nothing happened. The leopard took not the slightest notice of the light and just went on with that thump, 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 thump. The noise was so near that we seemed to be standing on top of it. Where the devil was it coming from? I played the light over the thorns again, this time more slowly. Something moved on the far side. The beam flicked back and held it. A leafy shoot was jerking to the same erratic rhythm as that strange thumping. I kept the light on it and tried to see through the thorns. They were too dense and a mass of winking pinpoints of reflected light. But the leopard was certainly on the ground at the back of them. How to get round to it? That the blaze from the torch had not so far worried it was not unusual, as leopards will often stand some time staring at a light. But the slightest sound would arouse it at once, and to work with the back of the thorns meant leaving the silence of the sandy track for the hazards of leaf and twig-strewn ground. But somehow we did it, with a luck that seemed miraculous. The light had to be kept on, for without it, we should never have picked our way. But time and again, as we inched round, we made small noises which the leopard must have heard. Yet it never moved, except to keep up that irregular thumping. The leopard came into the light suddenly. Its head was resting between its outstretched paws, and pointing away from us as it lay on the ground. I put the foresight on the back of its neck, and then edged nearer until its whole body came into view. My finger tightened on the trigger, and then I hesitated. What kind of a leopard was this? During the better part of 15 minutes, a bright light had been playing about the thorns. Now the light was shining straight at it, and I didn't believe that it had not heard our approach. Yet it was still here. Some strange fascination held me rooted and kept me staring at its spotted body. The leopard had dragged itself straight through the thorns. Some of the long, leafy trailers loaded with claws were wound tightly round one of its hind legs. And now I could see the cause of that thumping. It was the leopard's tail, which was hopelessly tangled in a mass of twisted tendrils. It was flicking up and down, but the movements were so listless that it seemed as though the leopard had long since given up hope of wrenching free. The leopard still had not looked round. It was uncanny, for as we peered round the edge of the thorns, we were only 20 paces away. Then, almost as if it had read my thoughts, the leopard stirred. With a movement that seemed lazy, it slowly raised its head from between its paws. My finger tightened on the trigger again, even though I felt sure that the leopard was still making no move to spring up. Very gently, the head shakes from side to side and then turns towards us. The shock was sudden and complete. I had been ready to see the blazing eyes and snarling mouth of a leopard when it looked into the light. But there were no eyes and no mouth. I caught my breath as the hideous mask turned full towards me. It was a featureless blank of an unearthly dull brown. I stared at it with a wave of horror surging through me. The thing on the ground seemed to be some multiversant devil of the forest in animal guise. Without realizing that I had squeezed the trigger, I saw the horror in front of me leap to the shock of the bullet. While its legs were still kicking in the air, I put in another shot and it lay quiet. Now I had to turn to control the dogs before they raced forward. When I looked again, the leopard's breathing had stopped. Slowly I went up to it and with the muzzle an inch from its neck, trod on the end of its tail. Devil or not, there was no longer any life in its body. I walked up to its head and looked down at the mask. For a few moments I was puzzled until I bent closer. Poor devil! It seemed to have taken nearly every pellet from a birdshot cartridge full in the face. Both eyes had been put out, and it was the second of 3 animals I have found blinded by criminally careless shooting. I believe, too, that its hearing must have been impaired, although it could not have been stone deaf. It had heard Sammy and had been able to keep near him, and when it had heard that last bark of alarm so near it, had made a desperate attempt to get itself a meal. That the dogs and I had been able to stalk it was not surprising, and nothing we are proud of. The leopard could not have seen us, and the fact that it didn't hear us either was thanks again to the man who fired that wicked shot. The end.